I'm very excited that we're hosting this conference, and I'm excited that we've got such great presenters and such great participants, all of you here in the audience, and folks who are watching at their computers, either around Minnesota or hopefully around the country. The first day of the conference obviously is focused on early childhood development. I think this is one of the signature accomplishments of the Minneapolis Fed. I think under Art's leadership and Rob's leadership, long before I joined, this bank did really, really important work in making the economic case of why investing in early childhood education is so important. And I think that's an example of the kind of contribution that a Federal Reserve Bank can make when it takes on issues that are really important and does it in an analytically rigorous way that's not about politics. It's just about trying to find the best answers for the community. And so I salute Art and Rob for all of their leadership. And we hope, we hope to follow in their footsteps, in making contributions like that. And then day two, of course, is focused on K through 12, which I also think is a big need and a big area where more work needs to be done. You know, I moved to Minnesota 3 years ago, and I did my research on Minnesota before I got here, and what I found was, what I expected to find is largely what I found, a state that's performing well on many dimensions. We have a very diverse economy. Most major sectors of the U.S. economy are represented here. So if certain sectors are down, other sectors are probably doing well. That serves us. On average, we have a very educated workforce. On average, we have good schools. And we have it's a thriving state. You know, most people think taxes are on the high side in Minnesota, but most people I talk to say we seem to get pretty good value for the taxes that we pay. So it seems like the state is largely a high-functioning state, and that's great. But when I got here, I was surprised to look beneath the surface and see the huge gaps that are here in Minnesota. Racial gaps, economic gaps, geographic disparities. So I started asking very basic questions. Why do these gaps exist? And you start looking at the data. These gaps are persistent, and they've been around a long, long time. And why are they so persistent? And I've got very few good answers to those questions. And the deeper I dove, I realized there are many layers of gaps or many layers of inequality. One layer that gets attention is wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is a buildup over decades or many generations of income inequality, which I think is a buildup of opportunity inequality, which I actually think goes back to education inequality. Education doesn't solve everything, but boy, it is at the root cause of a lot of the gaps in our society. And if you want to address a wealth gap or you want to address an income gap, you better first have addressed the education gap and the opportunity gap. I don't know how you address the others if you don't start with addressing the education gap. And so for me, I think education is absolutely one of the places we should be focused on. It's that important, because all of these other outcomes are at least in part dependent upon it. And I also think about my own life. I mean, my parents came here from India 50-some years ago. Now, I had some big advantages. My parents were educated. You know, we were in a middle-class household. My parents stressed education. But because I got a good education, every door in this country has been open to me. And so I feel like this is the greatest country in the world. If you get a good education, sky's the limit in terms of what you can achieve if you work hard, put your mind to it, and have some lucky breaks along the way. But you got to get that education. And so for me, I also have just a big interest in education as the equalizer that it should be in our society. So this work on trying to understand these gaps led us, Rob talked about the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. It led us to found this new research center at the Minneapolis Fed to focus squarely on these gaps. The Federal Reserve System nationally employs more PhD economists than any organization in the world. And if we can get some of those brilliant economists focusing on these kind of issues, we feel like there's a contribution we can make. So like Art and Rob showed us, even if we don't directly control early childhood education policy, if we can do the research, do the analysis, arm legislators, be they state or federal, with the data and analysis they need, they can then take it forward. And so I feel like that's a role that we can play and that we should be playing, not just in early childhood, but also in the K-2 through 12 sector. So this conference is not meant to be the end. It's hopefully part of the beginning of our participation in this really important work. Other things that I've heard, Minnesota has a very engaged business community. I've seen this firsthand. They really do care about Minnesota. They do care about their communities. And they've come to us and said, hey, they're fully behind early childhood. They've said to me, tell us what to get behind on K through 12. We want to be part of the solution, but we need to know what the analysis shows, where we should get behind and spend our resources. So us coming up to speed on recommended interventions that really could make a difference. That's part of why we want to do this, so that we can share our thoughts with them, because I think that that's a real advantage that we have as a state. And ultimately, why people sometimes push back and say, well, this is out of the Fed's mandate. And I would push back on them. Congress has given the Fed two goals. We call it our dual mandate. One goal is stable prices. That's an economy that's not overheating, but it's also an economy that's not limping along. The second goal that the United States Congress has assigned to the Federal Reserve is maximum employment, an economy where as many Americans who want to work are able to find jobs. Well, you know as well as I do that education is a huge determinant of those labor market outcomes. People with more and better education have lower unemployment across the economic cycle. And so for us to engage in education, I absolutely believe is part and parcel of our dual mandate goal, one of the mandates, which is maximum employment. So that's why we're here. That's why we've been here. That's why we will continue to be here. And then the last thing I'm going to say is I hope you all approach this conference with a great sense of urgency. I talk to education experts from around the country, and there's a 50-state laboratory that we can pick from. And we've got a lot of experts from around the country here. I talk to people who've been in the trenches for 30 years, and I ask them the same question: are we making progress? And usually they shout at me on the other end of the phone, and they say, are you kidding me? Look at the data. There's no evidence we're making progress. If anything, we're falling further and further behind. So I would ask you to challenge one another. Don't let this conference just be a bunch of well-meaning people with good ideas talking to each other. I'm asking you to challenge each other about, are we in fact making the difference that we are seeking to make? And how many more kids are going to drop out of school today and tomorrow and next week and the week after? And so we do need conferences like this. We do need to share ideas. We do need to learn from one another. But it cannot just be about a bunch of us getting together, hearing from one another, patting each other on the back, and then going about our daily lives. There must be a sense of urgency underneath everything that we're doing if we're going to change the trajectory and actually close some of these gaps, which we need to close. So thank you all for being here. I'm excited to learn from you, and I turn it back over to Rob.
Thank you, Neel. Well, if you're like me, you probably can't wait for this morning's first presentation. Stephanie Carlson is a distinguished McKnight University professor at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. And Professor Carlson's presentation on the lessons from the Marshmallow Test will be looking at this test over time, beginning in the 1960s. She co-authored this paper with a number of other researchers, but one of them is Walter Mischel, who originally started the Marshmallow Test at Stanford University in the 1960s. So let's all welcome Stephanie.
Okay, good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. So yes, I did have the opportunity to collaborate with Walter Mischel, and I want to share with you some of our findings and also future steps in this research. Okay. There we go. Okay. Before I get started, I will be talking about a measure that we developed and provide now through a startup company out of the University of Minnesota called Reflection Sciences. And so I wanted to declare my conflict of interest up front. So what is the Marshmallow Test? So most of you have probably heard of this, but in case you're wondering or trying to remember, the basic idea is this very simple test. And you have children, say a 4-year-old child, given this simple choice. You can have a small treat now, like one marshmallow, or if you wait until the researcher comes back into the room, you can have a larger reward, such as 2 marshmallows. Quite invariably, children choose to wait, but quite variably, they do or do not wait. In the end. So it's this child has chosen to wait, and they do some interesting things while they're waiting. They might inspect the marshmallows, they might smell them, they might try to lick them. And it gets rather torturous by the end, and the end could be as much as 20 minutes in some of Walter Mischel's research. So this is the man himself, Walter Mischel, who started this research when he was a professor at Stanford University in the late 1960s. And unfortunately, he did just pass last month. And I just want to make a real tribute to him and to his work and his legacy. He was an intellectual giant, not very tall in stature, but intellectually a giant, and a dear mentor and friend to me. So the Marshmallow Test is actually a classic measure of what we call executive function. Executive function is the brain-based set of skills that we use to control our thoughts, actions, and feelings. It's the brain basis for self-control and self-reliance. And it happens through verbally mediated thought. We literally talk ourselves through problems and through controlling ourselves. So in the Marshmallow Test, the way this might work, these three facets of executive function called working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. The working memory part would be to say to the self, I can remember the goal of this activity, which is to wait. The inhibitory control part would be to say, I can control my impulses and exert some willpower in this situation. And the flexibility or shifting part would be to come up with a new strategy spontaneously, like to distract yourself. And we see kids do really funny things when they're trying to wait, such as singing a song, making like a physical picture frame around the treats and so forth. So it's really just a classic measure of executive function. Well, we see development in performance on the Marshmallow Test. So just literally how long kids wait. And from about 2.5 to 5.5 years of age, these are all kids in my lab. We've been giving the Marshmallow Test to just about everyone who walks through the door in my lab over the years. So this is 680 kids. And you do see a significant but very kind of gradual and lazy developmental progression in performance in terms of how long kids wait. What's more striking, and what was more striking to Walter Mischel, is what they did while they waited, and the variability at any age. It's the individual differences at any age in how long kids wait and whether they wait that seems to be more diagnostic of what happens later. So I want to give you an example of, this is a 3-year-old child named Jane who came into our lab, and she participated in the Marshmallow Test. And it's important to point out that it's not always marshmallows. Not everybody likes marshmallows, and it's important that the treat be tempting to the child. So we give them a choice, and we make sure there are no food allergies and so forth first with the parents. This child chose raisins, believe it or not. She did have Fruit Loops and chocolate chips and other things to choose from, but she chose raisins. And she does an interesting strategy while she's waiting. She talks to herself in the third person. Oops, okay, so go ahead, thank you.
I want to eat those raisins. Is Jane going to eat them? So, let's see what Jane's going to do. If she takes one, Jane's not going to have all these. She might choke.
So she had just turned 3. She was rather precocious, even for a Minnesota child. And so let's see, how did Jane do? Well, if you recall, this is the developmental trajectory that we have found, and she had just turned 3, and she did not make it the entire 10 minutes in our study. She made it 7 minutes. She did eventually give in to the temptation of the raisin. But this is equivalent to how a typical 5-year-old would perform in this task. So in some sense, we could say, she is really precocious and a couple of years ahead of her peers on average in terms of how long she delayed. And we make the case that it was this self-talk, this reflective self-talk, that was a strategy that she spontaneously came up with that then inspired a whole series of studies in my lab where we suggested that strategy to kids and found in experiments that it actually did improve delay of gratification. So there have been some long-term outcomes associated with delay of gratification. This is from the Stanford University Bing preschool studies in the 1960s conducted by Walter Mischel and colleagues. And they tracked these individuals over time, most recently in published reports into their 40s. And whether and how long a child delays at age 4 did predict some interesting findings. In adolescence, these kids who had waited had better executive function on other measures. They had better academic outcomes in terms of grades and high school graduation. They had better social competence. They coped better with stressful situations. And they had significantly higher SAT scores after controlling for their age 4 IQ. In the 20s, they found that individuals who had delayed at age 4 had fewer interpersonal problems, fewer drug problems, had a higher education level, and better coping skills continuing. In the 30s, they had greater goal setting, were more planful, they had more retirement savings, and they had a lower body mass index. And then most recently in their 40s, individuals who had delayed at age 4 were better regulated in the face of socially rewarding stimuli, both behaviorally, and at this age they used fMRI as well to show the neural correlates of that. So these findings are impressive. A more recent longitudinal analysis suggested that it's far from deterministic whether a child delays gratification on the Marshmallow Test at age 4. And in fact, the effect sizes in some of the original work were higher than the more recent effect sizes with a larger sample and more diverse sample. Nonetheless, the Marshmallow Test continues to be a signal, a bellwether of executive function skills and all of the other sequelae of executive function later in development. So we asked a different question. Walter Mischel had been doing his book tour in 2014 with his book called The Test. And the question that he got again and again on this tour was, what about kids today? So this is all fine and good, but there's no way that kids today have good delay of gratification. It's gotten worse. And this is a common sort of received wisdom. One older gentleman said that children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children now are tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teachers. So we wanted to verify that this was sort of a broadly held view. First, with a national survey study using MTurk, 354 adults participated. And you can see some of their demographics here. A little over half of them were parents themselves. And we asked them, we described the Marshmallow Test paradigm to them, in case they weren't familiar with it, and then said, so when compared with 50 years ago, do you think kids today would wait a shorter amount of time, the same amount of time, or longer than kids had 50 years ago? And what you can see overwhelmingly here is that they predicted that they would wait a shorter amount of time today. Around 75% of the adults that we surveyed said this. So then we wanted to actually look at the data. And so we were in a really unusual and fortunate situation here to be able to do that, because the Marshmallow Test has been virtually unchanged in the last 50, 60 years. There aren't many assessments, certainly not early childhood self-control assessments, that you can say that about. So Walter had the data from the 60s. Our colleague Larry Aber had the data from Barnard College at Columbia from the 1980s. And we had the data from University of Washington and University of Minnesota from the 2000s up until we cut off our data analysis at 2012. And these three samples were limited in that they were not socioeconomically or racially and ethnically diverse. This is a disadvantage of the study. It was an advantage, however, in that we knew we were comparing the same kinds of kids from the 1960s through the 2000s. And we've followed all three of the investigations use the same procedure, the standard procedure. So what did the data show? The data showed a significant linear increase in delay time across these decades, on the order of about 1 minute longer per cohort. So the kids in the 2000s then were delaying on average 2 minutes longer than kids had been in the 1960s. So why did adults get it wrong? Why might you have predicted the opposite as well? Well, one reason is it's sort of the same as it ever was in terms of persistent complaints about kids today. That older gentleman that I quoted earlier was Socrates. And it could have been my father, right? But this is a persistent phenomenon. It also could be a lack of perspective taking. So we as adults have lost perspective and a sort of first-person sense of what it's like to be a kid. And it's true that they do have less self-control than you. And so maybe that's why we continually make this intuitive error. Adults also talk a lot about concerns about technology, screen time. This must be eroding children's cognition and certainly their self-control. And that was a common comment. It also could be that our standards have risen. So this from Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now. He says, as we care about more of humanity, we're apt to make the harms around us, mistake the harms around us for signs of how low the world has sunk rather than how high our standards have risen. And I would argue that it's okay to have higher standards. So why has delay of gratification improved? Well, there are basics, and I leave it to the economists in the room and around the world to look at things like gross domestic product, how nutrition has improved, and so forth. So there has been progress en masse in many ways that would correlate with the progress that we see in delay of gratification in young children. But as psychologists, we were most interested in kind of what could be going on in the mind and in the rearing experiences of kids that could explain these findings. So one thing is abstract thought. So you recall Jane and how she kind of talked herself through that. She did what we call self-distancing. She referred to herself in the third person, and this provided a little bit of distance or mental space between herself and her situation. And when you do that, you can see your options more clearly. And abstract thought is one potential benefit of technology, despite all the potential pitfalls of children and screen times and technology. One thing that technology does is give you more practice with abstract thought, with that kind of psychological distance. And we've seen IQ rise across this same period on the order of about 3 points per decade, according to James Flynn in his analysis. And he does attribute it largely to increases in abstract thought. Parenting, though, has also changed for the better. And at least in Sweden, this is the case, where over this exact same time period of our study, parents in Sweden became what we call more autonomy supportive, less controlling and more supportive of the child's autonomy and developing self-reliance. It's likely to be the case in the United States as well, although we need to do more research to verify that. And lastly, preschool education has changed dramatically. So this is data from Andrew Karch here at the University of Minnesota, showing the rise in preschool enrollment, both public and private. Of course, Head Start is something that came online in the late 1960s as well. And so not only has enrollment changed, but the nature and the goals of early childhood education have changed. It's moved from being custodial care so that parents can work to a greater focus and emphasis on on education and early childhood education, including self-regulation and the social and interpersonal skills that children need to be ready for school. So all of those are potential reasons. But our work is far from over, and that's one reason that we're all here today. The studies that I described to you were mostly middle, upper class, mostly white participants. And we have seen, as more of these assessments have been administered with a larger representation of society, that in fact, children from lower education, lower income homes do not perform as well on measures like the Marshmallow Test. These are data from Watts et al. Showing children of non-college educated versus college educated mothers in terms of their delay time. And there was essentially a ceiling effect in the children of the college educated mothers, and a significantly lower performance in the non-college group. In my own data, using the Marshmallow Test, we've also seen similar things. I've had the opportunity to work with Megan Gunner to investigate post-institutionalized preschool children. So these are children adopted from institutions abroad who are now in well-resourced homes, but have kind of a legacy of difficulty around executive function skills. And I've worked with Ann Maston and People Serving People here in Minneapolis to look at children who are homeless and highly mobile. And in both of those groups, we do see significantly lower delay times on the Marshmallow Test. So one question that has come up about this test in particular is that isn't it possible that it's actually more adaptive not to wait if you have food insecurity and if there's some white person telling you that they're going to come back with more if you just wait here. And it's quite possible that not waiting and actually a bird in the hand is a more adaptive strategy if resources are really scarce. And so Kidd et al. Did a simulation of this, not with low-income kids, but with a representative sample of lab kids who were given the Marshmallow Test with either a reliable or an unreliable researcher. So the researcher had previously interacted with the child and come back with what was promised, which was crayons so that they could, a nice set of crayons that they could use, or this experimenter came back and said, I'm sorry, I don't have them after all. You're going to have to use these broken crayons. And then put them in the Marshmallow Test situation. And the kids who had had experience with that researcher as being unreliable didn't wait at all. But the kids who had experience with a reliable experimenter did. There was a huge difference despite a small sample size. So low trust, low resource environments, maybe that's why we see this difference. So this points out some of the limitations of the Marshmallow Test as a measure that we could use more broadly because it does involve food rewards. And that is a conflict then for children with food insecurity. And because it does involve trust, and that also presents a problem for the reasons I just noted. It's also not really possible to give this measure under age 3 because kids don't understand the contingency. And it doesn't really work past age 10 because kids are not really sure why they would wait at all for something so small as this when they could go play on their iPad. And it has a bimodal distribution. So kids do tend to eat the treat within the first 30 seconds or stick it out for however long you have them go. So it's more of a fail or a pass measure that psychometrically doesn't lend itself very well to looking at gradual changes. It's not very sensitive to gradual changes. It's also not good for repeated assessment. At least in my lab, after they go through the delay, we can't reuse the treats, so we just kind of give it all to them. And then the jig is up, and it doesn't really work to put them through that again. It's also not practical for school settings. So as people become more aware of executive function and its importance for early childhood education, you might want to do this outside of laboratory settings. And of course, you can't really leave kids alone in rooms for 15 minutes in a school setting. And then lastly, it was never age normed. So we don't really know how to compare kids of different ages and different regions of the country and so forth on a measure like this. So we have a solution to this in terms of newer measures that get around some of those limitations of the Marshmallow Test. One is something that we developed here called the Minnesota Executive Function Scale. So my colleague Phil Zalazzo and I developed this out of research that we've been conducting for a couple of decades on executive function, and really kind of pared it down to a simple game-like app that the kids play. And what they do is sort these virtual cards into these virtual boxes, and they have to follow rules. And the rules get more complex as you progress through the game. So for example, this is level 3 of the game, and we say, look, I have these boxes here. This one has a frog on it, and this one has a butterfly on it. This is the shape game. In the shape game, all the frogs go here, and all the butterflies go here. And then we would flip the card and say, see, here's a frog. It goes in the frog box. And we would have butterflies as well. And after a few trials like this, it's no problem for most 3-year-olds. But then we switch and we say, okay, we're not going to play the shape game anymore. Now we're going to play the color game. In the color game, all the red ones go here and all the blue ones go here. And this now becomes very challenging for a typical 3-year-old who will perseverate and actually keep playing the old game, even though she could tell you that they're supposed to be playing the color game now. It's a lot like what Luria observed in his frontal patients. So patients who had lesions to prefrontal cortex, who were 70 years old, would also make that same kind of mistake. And it's because the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped. So this measure is also capturing those 3 facets of executive function: cognitive flexibility, working memory, and inhibitory control in an efficient way. So we've given this assessment by trained and certified examiners over 50,000 times now through many locations across the United States, as well as 13 countries, and it's now translated into 10 languages. So when we put these data on the MEFS, the Minnesota Executive Function Scale, together with Phil Zalazzo's adult data, and the assessment is now normed. The Minnesota Executive Function Scale is normed from age 2 to 13, and then a separate sample of adults. What we see is we've been able to trace the whole trajectory of executive function development, starting at age 2, all the way through age 70, as shown here, using the same scale, the same measure. And unfortunately, you can see that it peaks in one's early to mid-20s and then declines after that, on average. So using the MEFS, when we compare our lab samples to community preschool samples to our at-risk samples, so including homeless and highly mobile, post-institutionalized, and so forth, what we see here is that we show again the difference in performance on an executive function measure, this time with the MEFS. And this is importantly controlling for age and IQ. So we've statistically equated IQ in all 3 groups. And what you see here is that there's still a gap that's not explained by IQ. It's explained by executive function. And so we call this the executive function gap. And in fact, lower socioeconomic status is associated with lower executive function in a linear fashion, such that the greater number of periods in poverty by age 4, the lower the executive function performance. Trauma plays a role here as well. So trauma is really devastating for the development of executive function skills. And what we see here is the number of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the risk for negative outcomes. including executive function in some more recent analyses showing parents with higher ACEs have kids with lower executive function scores. So executive function and this executive function gap could be really crucially important as we try to address school readiness and school achievement. And there are a couple of reasons why. So one is that executive function plays an indirect role, at least, in creating the optimal conditions for learning. So sometimes when we think about self-control and we think about behavior management, we think about, you have to sit still and you have to pay attention. And those are really important skills. You have to persist when you're frustrated. You have to learn how to manage conflict with peers. And those all depend on executive function skills, and they are really important to school readiness and school success. But executive function also plays a direct role in the learning process itself. Through working memory, you have to hold new information in mind and work with it to be able to encode it and process it and remember it later. You have to inhibit old information or biases that interfere when you're learning new information. So learning multiplication after you've learned addition and overlearned addition is actually quite hard. If the teacher calls out, what's 3 times 3? Children are likely to raise their hand and impulsively say 6, because they're applying something they learned before, a habit, to something new, and it's inappropriate in this context, and they're not reflecting on that and taking that into account. And thinking about problems in a new way is how children learn. So when we think about this executive function gap that we're able to capture as young as age 2, this leads to, and I would argue is a prelude to, the achievement gap that we are also concerned about and how persistent it is, which in turn, as we know, creates gaps in opportunity and well-being. Early intervention is a key here. So although it's never too late to intervene and make a positive difference in somebody's life, the economic analyses in terms of return on investment and so forth, suggest that earlier is better. So we can quibble about the exact dollar to dollar return on investment, but there's no question that it is greater earlier. And so why not focus on the earliest gap that we can detect and pick up on, which is the executive function gap? So we've learned a lot about how executive function develops. And we can think of executive function as the roots of both academic and social emotional development. So if this is like a tree of success, you really need both academic achievement and education attainment to be successful, but you also need good interpersonal skills and emotion regulation. And you can all think of coworkers, perhaps, who have been strong in one area but not so much in the other. And it doesn't have to do with IQ. So if executive function is the roots, how do we nurture and cultivate these roots? We do it through quality caregiving. We do it through language input. And of course, the first things first, adequate nutrition and sleep are really important as well. I will just mention that stress, mild stress, could be kind of like the wind in this scenario or with this metaphor. And mild stress is actually a positive thing. So getting a little bit nervous before a test, for example, does improve performance. But chronic or toxic stress is something that would eat at the very roots of executive function. And we have a really good understanding of the neural bases and the neural effects of stress on cognitive and neurocognitive development. So the Minnesota Executive Function Scale is responsive to intervention. So as I mentioned, it's a very sensitive tool. And these are individuals who all were in an intervention called reflection training that we did in our lab, or in the field, but it was developed by us. And they performed significantly better than an active control group from pre-test to post-test. But what was really interesting to us was that when we divided the intervention group into relatively high and low socioeconomic status, we found that the low SES group benefited even more from the intervention. And this is a common finding. So are we closing the gap? Well, I would argue that we can start to look at that earlier in preschool than has been done before. And we can use data like these to make informed decisions about what's working, where it's working, why it's working. To compare, these are all low-income preschools with performance on the MEFs, and some of them they vary in quality, and some of them are doing better than others. And this is the kind of thing that we can glean from this research. So in terms of take-home messages, the Marshmallow Test is a classic measure of executive function. And individual differences in delay are highly stable in the absence of intervention. And they do predict later outcomes. And despite adult predictions, of course, it's gotten better over time. And preschool education might be one reason why. We don't know, however, about lower socioeconomic status children and if they have also shown similar gains over the past 50, 60 years. Instead, we have to use newer tools to look forward to answer that question. And I will leave it at that so that we have time for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. So we're going to have a couple microphones that will be moving around the room. So we'll start with Neel.
Very interesting presentation. Two very quick questions. One is there a gender difference? I would just imagine that girls are better at this test than boys. Curious if that's true. And then second, you talked about this test, the Marshmallow Test, was not useful to give repeatedly to the same child. I'm just curious, can you explain that? Because I'm guessing you could coach a child to perform better. And would that just be sort of called teaching to the test, in which case it loses its informative usefulness? I'm just curious if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so first with respect to gender differences, short answer, yes. In some of our early work with the MEFs, we were not seeing a gender difference, but now with over 50,000 tests and a much more representative sample, including a lot more lower income individuals and kids, we do see that girls are performing about 5% national percentile points better than boys. We also see, we see other kinds of differences. Again, with such a large data set, we can look at geographical differences and so forth. And then with the Marshmallow Test, I think that it's just a little bit of once children kind of know how this works, we're not really sure if it's as diagnostic the second time around. But you are right that you can suggest strategies to kids. So you could get a baseline and then suggest a strategy and have them do it again. And that might be, a valid way to start looking at intervention.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the slides that you moved through relatively quickly showed on the horizontal axis, I think, a measure of parental income, so sort of a gradation of socioeconomic status, and then it showed executive functioning on the vertical axis. I missed the values on that, so I'm wondering if you can talk about the gap in executive functioning and how, if at all, it's significant in future outcomes.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I did go through it rather quickly. This one? Yeah. Okay. So this is on the x-axis is the number of 12-month periods that the child by age 48 months has experienced at or below the U.S. poverty line. So essentially, if they've had 3 such periods, it's basically their whole life, they've been at or below the U.S. Poverty line. And this is a composite measure of executive function given at age 48 months.
So then that gap in 3 or 4 points, what does that tell us? What does that difference bear out in the future? Do we know that?
We don't. So that's a great question. Yeah. So my hope is that we can use these tools moving forward to actually do some of that longer term prediction.
To what extent might it be possible for quality care to overcome the stressors of extreme poverty?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
When you talked about how to nurture executive function, you talked about quality care and then mentioned the factors that relate to poverty that undermine it. to what extent do you think quality care can actually overcome the toxic effect of poverty? And when you talk about quality care, are there particular components of quality care that you think are more potent?
Yes, great question. So we are seeing that, and our company, Reflection Sciences, does have a sincere focus on addressing quality care in low-income kids and measuring these gains. And we're seeing some pretty phenomenal gains in executive function. So, you know, trying, in many cases, these kids are starting at, you know, the 25th, 30th percentile nationally. But we are seeing, you know, 10-point gains in that from fall to spring with intentional curricula around executive function skills. And so there's a lot of variability. What the best practices have in common is that they, in some way, shape, or form, are focusing on increasing reflection in kids. So sometimes this is done through modeling verbal mediation, through play-based curricula, and through some deliberate exercises that are like games for kids. So some of these old-fashioned games that you might have played, Simon Says and Red Light, Green Light, these are actually executive function measures in disguise. So some of those activities as well do seem to help improve executive function. And there are a lot of providers here in Minnesota who are taking this very seriously, some of them in this room, and really making some gains there. So absolutely quality early childhood education where you provide children with the language input, the quality caregiving, the autonomy supportive caregiving, play-based curricula, practice, increasing challenge level so that they don't get complacent with kind of where they are in their level of executive function. These are all things that we can actually do and do seem to be making a difference.
Stephanie, I have a question about validating your tool. You know, your new test. I think for sure I would fail. But my question is, how do you validate that? It seems like executive function is a pretty complex, in some ways, concept. So I'm curious about the validation. How do you know you're testing what the concept?
Right. So we, in a long period of research before this tool was more broadly available, we did a lot of validation work. So it's hard once you get below age 4 to validate this tool against a gold standard because there just really isn't a gold standard. But there are a number of measures that we and others have used over the years at certain ages to measure executive function, and this tool correlates well with those tools. So in terms of, you know, sort of construct validity, it's done well. It's also done well in terms of retest reliability. And then in more criterion validity, we're looking at what are the outcomes that it actually predicts. And so we do see that it predicts, you know, parent and teacher report of child achievement and behavior, and we're seeing that it predicts into kindergarten and first grade math achievement. And it's only been around since 2014, so we're waiting for some of the longer outcomes.
And true for low income. You're validating this for low income kids in particular.
For all.
For all?
Yeah.
Okay.
But we actually have enough data now to have separate norms for low income kids.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I hope this doesn't come across too critical, but I have that adaptive, that kind of limitation slide in mind. So I'm wondering, that got me thinking, is EF something that we should be worrying about improving in and of itself, or is it maybe more an indication that we should be improving other things? So kind of the roots of the figure, if that question makes sense.
I guess I'm sorry, I'm not quite following you. So I do see executive function as the roots in the figure.
Right. So, but is it more of a sign? I'll try to give an example, maybe, that we should be helping kids sleep more, or working on nutrition. So, is it more an indication that we should be fostering an environment and a developmental kind of broader context for the student that will result in improving executive function?
That's right.
Or is it should we be focused? It's kind of a subtle question. Should we be
yeah.
focusing on executive function as a thing we're trying to improve kind of directly?
Yeah.
I know it's a bit of a nuance, but
Right.
I thought I would try to see if you could help me out with that.
Can I have both?
Well, of course. You have the stage.
Yeah, so, really this is meant to exemplify the things we can do. The things above the soil are the things that we have some control over more directly. So I don't think we are going to want to, necessarily go in and zap kids' brains to try to get more directly at those executive function skills. But no, these are the things that our research, in terms of what we've learned about what correlates well with, and there's some experimental evidence as well that these things do improve executive function skills.
I had a question about the ability to intervene on executive functioning. So as I understand it, there's some debate about how much, when you sort of do a training or a strategy for one type of behavior, that it transfers more broadly to other behaviors. So we might be able to get kids good at sorting cards, but that doesn't mean that in a different context that they would perform as well. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what we need to learn in order to build better interventions as opposed to what we already know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of those kind of sometimes referred to as like narrow transfer, some of the early work looking at executive function intervention focused on like spatial working memory, computerized spatial working memory training, and very intensive and rote practice with spatial working memory. And then, lo and behold, it didn't necessarily transfer to the classroom and other behavior. What we argue in terms of what's needed to increase transfer is you have to train the skills in multiple contexts. So if you only train it in one context, you're only likely to see it in that context. But if you train the skills in multiple contexts, you're much more likely to see transfer. And so a lot of the work that we're doing emphasizes, more whole child approach in terms of not just educating teachers about this, but also engaging with parents about it so that the messages and the practices are consistent in school and at home. So engaging parents is really key. And not just training it in, carving out your 20 minutes of executive function exercises in the classroom, but actually sprinkling it throughout your academic instruction. And there are ways to do that. If you're trying to teach literacy, for example, play Simon Says, but make the signal not did Simon say, but make the signal did my word start with an H. If my word started with an H sound, a H sound, then you do the action that I'm doing. But if I say any other sound, then you don't do the action. There are ways to integrate executive function practice with instructional practice as well.